This is the Trench Art Podcast with your host, David Axe. Today on the pod, war correspondent and analyst David Kirichenko. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm a Ukrainian-American journalist and researcher, and since 2022, I've spent extensive amount of time on the front lines, embedding myself with units, and have been in the center of battles such as the siege of Bakhmut in 2022. Spent time on the southern front, was embedded with drone units and in Chasiv Yar was also spent time with the tank unit in the battle for Toretsk. And yeah, just have been writing and spending a lot of time on the front lines throughout the Russo-Ukrainian war. And my family on my dad's side is originally from Donbass. So even as far back as 2017, I went and would visit family in the first war from 2014, and saw what was happening there, and have had relatives that have been fighting in the war for many years, and let's say it's very close and personal to me. And a lot of what motivates my mission and the work that I do is wanting to contribute to the cause and ensure that I think Ukraine has a perspective that's offered to the wider world, of which has been Ukrainian voices, and the Ukrainian perspective throughout history has always been suppressed and neglected. And even now, I'd say it's a struggle to get a Ukrainian line of thinking and a perspective out to the world. And a lot of what I try to focus on is some of the underreported aspects of the war, and focusing on a lot of the advances that Ukraine is making on the technological front, especially when it comes to asymmetrical warfare and fighting back against Russia.
Well, great. So you should have a not only an analytical perspective on what we're going to talk about today, but also a personal perspective, and that is de-mechanization. That is the profound losses in vehicles and other heavy equipment that the Russians have suffered in the 41 months since widening their war on Ukraine. Uh, as of today, according to probably one of our most reliable counts of Russian losses. That would be from the open source intelligence collective Oryx, which uses videos and photos from the front line to visually confirm heavy equipment losses on both sides of the wider war. As of today, according to Oryx, Russia has lost 22,225 vehicles and other pieces of heavy equipment, of which destroyed 17,060, damaged 905, abandoned 1,176, captured 3,084. To put into perspective how much equipment that is, we need only look at. I need to get my cat out of the way, honey. You're in the way of my browser. Thank you. We only need only to look at the military balance, IISS's report on military inventories from 2022 to look at how many vehicles Russia had in service prior to the wider war. And the total is going to come to around 3,000 tanks, 5,200 infantry fighting vehicles, 6,000 armored personnel carriers, and about 5,000 artillery pieces. So, in other words, after 41 months, the Russians have lost about as much equipment, heavy equipment, as they had in active service prior to the wider war. The question, of course, is, does it matter that Ukraine is destroying all of this equipment, especially given Ukraine's own heavy losses? So, David, first question, how is Ukraine destroying all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it boils down to the use of artillery and drones. I think certainly in mines, I think a really important thing is taking care of the basics really well, getting the right trenches built on different parts of the front and the right ensuring that it's well mined. Often we see, whether it's in Sum and the ongoing offensive, is I think one of the frustrating things, just time and time again, that we see some of the really basics neglected by some of Ukraine's military leadership. I think one of the more infuriating points was the Russian assault on Toretsk the other year, when they were able to launch that offensive and take a part of Toretsk. And as long as you have the right trench system built, you have the right mining in place, then Ukrainian artillery and drones will absorb the Russian heavy armor and the tanks and other vehicles that are charging in. And I think the drones act really well in terms of disabling, or vice versa. If the artillery has an accurate hit on some of the Russian heavy armor, the drones can just send in a wave of drones, of 4 or 5 drones, and destroy the tank. And so it really depends, and I think a lot of attention, rightfully so, has been given to the role that drones have played and the danger of a $500 drone and what it could do to a tank. But it still doesn't substitute for artillery, and you certainly need a lot of artillery. And Ukraine's pivot to drones, even for disabling a lot of this heavy armor, came from a lack of artillery. And of course, the Ukrainian commanders are always telling me that they urgently need more artillery pieces, more drones. But yeah, we very much see drones playing just a huge aspect in disabling a lot of this Russian armor on the front.
Is Russia able to replace this lost equipment?
Yeah, I think it very much depends on the rate at which Ukraine is destroying it, and I think Russia is able to replace aspects and certain volumes of its heavy armor, and not as fast as it's being depleted. I do think we're seeing a lot of the Russians tapping into like older and older heavy armor, and in other ways they are like trying to scale up production. And I think their new defense minister is overseeing positive improvements in the procurement on the Russian side, and bringing like a more focused approach into Russia's ability to manufacture. But of course, Russia's ability to replace also starts to put pressure on other aspects of the war effort, such as Russia's economy. And the more that Russia needs to reallocate resources and invest into reproducing it, I think the more that Russia draws away resources from productive sectors of the economy, and it contributes to a whole host of other issues like inflation and other economic issues that Russia's leadership needs to grapple with. And the other point is that a lot of Russian heavy armor no longer plays the role that it was playing in the first few years of the war. And what surprised me is kind of the lag that we saw of how much attention was given, especially throughout 2025, to Russia's motorcycle assaults, or even just infantry assaults on foot. I would say even my time being embedded with units over the last few years, we saw the trend on the battlefield much earlier on, and the Russians were gradually transitioning to relying less on heavy armor, just because it's a big open target. And if you're driving on a road that's well mined and you hit a mine and you're somewhat paralyzed and hit by a barrage of Ukrainian drones, and you're stuck out there in no man's land, and these drones destroy your vehicle, then you're trying to escape by foot and they hunt you down. And so the one Ukrainian drone unit commander told me at the start of 2025 is he doesn't think that Russia has a shortage of heavy armor, it's just that they can't really utilize it anymore, and motorcycles give them a higher chance of success in their operations. Just as long as you can drive fast and maneuver through the mines, then you're able to more quickly assault the Ukrainian positions.
Russia's made doctrinal changes in response to its heavy losses, and these include these motorcycle assaults, where the Russians don't, or infantry assaults where the Russians don't need heavy vehicles that are in increasingly short supply, owing to the heavy losses over 41 months. What are the What are the battlefield implications, though, of these doctrinal changes? Can the Russians can they achieve their theory of victory with the shift to motorcycle and footborne assaults? Can you gain the ground? Can the Russians gain the ground they want to gain if they're not fighting in the traditional mechanized manner?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly becomes much harder to achieve any sort of, call it a big and beautiful breakthrough. And when I was on the front and just seeing these zombie assaults conducted by the Russians, they just send in waves of these soldiers, and I mean, the drones pick them off, and the Russians hope that with enough charges, enough soldiers over a few weeks can maybe gather into the bunker of a building, and when they get there, they start digging in really deep and try to build trenches. And over time, once they have enough soldiers that aggregate in that area and they're ready to assault the neighboring street, the Russians will launch glide bombs, launch artillery fire, everything that they have, and allow their soldiers to conduct these meat grinder assaults street by street and to try to take territory very slow. And the fact that they're charging with very limited supply on a motorcycle or on by foot means they make very slow and incremental progress. But I think as a result of just of how big of a challenge it is to penetrate Ukraine's drone wall, it means that I think Russia's focus or theory of victory is shifting in the war. I think at a minimum, Russia certainly wants to finish taking Donetsk Oblast, but Russia's ability to scale its drone production, especially with the Shaheds, and use hundreds of them on a daily basis to target Ukrainian cities. I think what Russia's focused on is, as long as they can hold on and continue pressing Ukraine with these offensives, they would hope to put more pressure on Ukraine's government and Ukrainian society and hope that there is some sort of collapse behind Ukrainian front lines to be able to help Russia with the political victory. And you don't necessarily need to have a really big breakthrough on the battlefield, but you just need to continue the pressure and put more pressure on Ukraine to conduct mobilization, continue putting more men on the front lines and trying to hold off these Russian offensives. And I think Russia's leadership understands that, and they think that they have the advantage right now with a lot of Western leaders being distracted, and I think that's Russia's focus, at least for the rest of the year.
But surely there are implications for the Russian armed forces thinking past Ukraine, thinking whenever and however this wider war ends, Russia may continue to be to represent a threat to NATO, to especially NATO's easternmost members. Is a de-mechanized Russian army, one that has learned in Ukraine to fight on foot or on motorcycles or in other civilian vehicles, is a de-mechanized Russian military the same kind of threat that the mechanized Russian military was prior to 2022, a threat to NATO?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that's also just going to depend on how fast the Europeans scaled their own production and how the Europeans prepare for a future war against Russia. Even if the Russians don't rely on as many mechanized assaults, or it is the case that maybe the Russians transition back to using more mechanized assaults in a European offensive, likely in the Baltics, but there's a lot of talk and I think European investment going on into building a drone wall along its eastern flank. And if Europe is successful in building a strong defensive barrier there, I think drone operations very much favor defensive operations. And Russia is like very specialized now in conducting these de-mechanized assaults, and I think Europe needs to more quickly take lessons learned from Ukraine. And if this is what the battlefield along eastern flank is going to look like, they're certainly going to need to one, ramp up production of their drones, learn how to integrate these drones, and I think even very nuanced points. I think one thing that's underreported or neglected is the complexity of the software that goes into integrating a lot of the data feeds, signals into a centralized platform that different units can work with one another. And for Ukraine, a core part of this would be its Delta platform. And I even on the front line with drone units watch how the commanders are looking at all these different data feeds, and how all the software is working together to be able to help commanders work through the complex layout of the battlefield. And Europe is going to need to address a lot of these points, and it's not enough just to say, okay, we're going to scale drone production. I think the Russians are very effective at what they're doing. They are really good at learning, and I remember in 2022 and 2023, the Russians would often find a Ukrainian drone and be able to copy the engineering and get something out into the battlefield within a few months. Now, often when Ukraine deploys new technology and the Russians capture it or take it from a downed drone, the drone units will tell me that within even 2 to 3 weeks, they can often see the Russians replicate the model or the drone tech and deploy it on the battlefield. And so the Russians are very good at being able to copy and scale something. And it's going to be very effective from what it has learned in the war, and potentially being able to replicate those successes against Europe on its eastern flank.
So the implications for NATO of Russia's de-mechanization are potentially that a drone-based defense works. What are the implications for Western armies' battlefield doctrine on the offense? Is the Ukraine war teaching Western armies a new way of combined arms, fighting combined arms, that relies less on mechanization?
I mean, I think that's one of the most important questions military planners need to address right now. And again, Ukraine's necessity for how much it came to rely on drones wasn't exactly where it wanted to go. It just came from a lack of supplies, and especially a lack of artillery. And if we think back to even Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023, the fact that you had soldiers crawling through these minefields attempting to disable the mine by hands, when ideally you'd be able to go in and just carpet bomb some of these fields and send in your heavy armor to break through. And for Ukraine, one thing that I heard from whether it was like tank units or other units on the front, is the complexity of Ukraine needed to take so many systems from many different countries and figure out how to standardize and wage combined arms warfare. And given the very limited amount of time that its soldiers had trained, and then trying to get all these soldiers trained on different systems, different equipment, and have them work together in such a short amount of time to wage the counteroffensive was extremely challenging and really hard to do for any military in the world. And I think right now what Europe really needs to focus on is it has many different militaries, a lot of different weapon systems, and the focus on, okay, if a conflict did actually break out, how do we focus on making everything work together and work well? And I think Israel and Iran is also showing us, and just like the Russo-Ukrainian war, of how important air superiority is. And there's certainly going to be lessons of the Russo-Ukrainian war that we shouldn't over-index on. And I think Western militaries would be able to still leverage, whether it's being able to more accurately kill a lot of these drone teams that are out on the front lines and paralyze the views. And then you'd be able to render a lot of the ground operations ineffective, and potentially sending in more mechanized assaults on certain parts of the front.
So, David, you're a war correspondent of years of experience. How many times have you been to Ukraine?
Since the full-scale invasion, I think around 6 times.
And you're heading back soon. What are you hoping to learn on this next trip?
Uh, Currently negotiating with different units to go to the front on cover more of the ground robotics. I think that's one of the next, well, it is already one of the main stages or where things are trending towards right now, and replacing as many human functions as possible with some of these ground robots, and covering that subject.
Why is that so important?
I think one, the ability to maneuver on the front. As far back as 2023, I was with a drone unit in Donetsk, and this was, I believe, March of 2023, and I already saw one drone unit build a custom RC car packed with explosives, and they drove it right into a Russian trench and like blew up that Russian trench. So it was pretty early on in the war. They already saw some of these Ukrainian units trying to build some of these smaller ground vehicles or ground robots and trying to hit the Russian trenches or Russian positions. And in December of 2024, we saw Ukraine conduct the first all-out robotic assault on Russian position. But of course, there's no such a thing where you can completely replace humans, and it takes a lot of humans to just deploy the robots and ground robots. And then what if your ground robot's deployed and it gets stuck on a field? And the complexity of just deploying it, maneuvering it, having drones, people watching it, ensuring that it's actually conducting its mission. It takes a lot of human operators behind the scenes, and just of carrying a larger ground robot vehicle and transporting it. And for Ukraine, I think it's a necessity just because you're fighting against a much larger power. And Ukraine does prioritize its soldiers in protecting their lives, and fighting against a much bigger power. Ukraine throughout the war has needed to leverage technology to be able to fight back and take the fight to Russia. And the ground robots, a lot of the functions that they're already playing is delivering supplies to the front line. Now, according to Russian sources, it was around 70% of Ukrainian casualties happen during some of these logistics and resupply runs. Ukraine has a desperate need for pickup trucks and other vehicles. It's a very, very dangerous mission just trying to go on a resupply. I've been on, like when I would be embedded with the drone unit on the front, typically I'd go on a resupply van, and you're just flying straight into the front line. And the worry is that drones, the Ukrainian side does this and the Russian side also does this, but they drop bombs, or they have now fiber optic drones on the road waiting for you. So if you go too slow trying to avoid a mine, you can more easily get hit by a drone, or any other Russian weapon system such as artillery. Or if you drive too fast, you'd more easily drive over a mine. So it's just a very dangerous game of kind of randomness of how you might die when you're driving out. And then as soon as you come out into the front, wherever the unit is, or where the soldiers are dug in, whether it's like in a basement or a certain area, and the vehicle drives up. I mean, the doors open and it all happens just in a flash. Like all the supplies pop out, you hop out, and you just gotta run for cover. And often on some of those missions, we'd arrive and the buildings around us are already burning because the Russian artillery is pummeling the area. And if the Russian drone spots you, then at one point there was just a barrage of drones hovering above looking for us. And it's just an extremely dangerous mission that I've witnessed firsthand. And when I was evacuated from the position after some time and on a resupply run, I didn't even have enough time to like fully get into the vehicle before my driver was already reversing and trying to turn the corner and drive. And while I was trying to close the door and get the rest of my leg in, and you're just driving, and it's like the whole street is just either burning or there's smoke coming out because the Russians keep pummeling it in. So it's extremely dangerous just trying to do the very basics of driving back to the front, delivery, new bombs for the drones, water, food, any other basic supplies that the soldiers need on the front line. And often these vehicles will get hit, and Ukrainian soldiers need to buy vehicles and repair them constantly. So the more that you can get ground robots through those very dangerous missions of getting resupplies, handling your logistics, the more that you can save your human soldiers. And right now they're experimenting a lot more with medical evacuation. So I spent time with medics near the front as well, and medics are a big target for Russian drone operators. And even if they have the cross sign, or they signal that they're there to provide medical attention to soldiers, the Russians will try to target and kill them because they know that they're going to go and take a wounded Ukrainian soldier, and it's a good target for the Russians to hit. And so they just don't care whether or not you're a medical person or not, or a volunteer. I've known many volunteers that have been targeted or killed by the Russians, even when they're evacuating civilians. And the more that you can have the ground robots doing these types of operations, just the more lives that you can save. But it's not without its risk. What happens when the ground robot has a soldier and it gets stuck, or a Russian drone is able to disable that ground robot, then you just have an injured soldier lying out there. What happens if the Russians are able to jam? It's like, do you continue moving into trying to deploy more of these fiber optic ground robots to make them resistant to jamming? But I think for right now, the signature of some of these ground robots is lower than a vehicle or like a truck driving out there. And so I think more of these ground robots are getting through like into the front and without attracting too much attention, or at least that's what I've been hearing from some people on the front. And so certainly very excited to see the different models and how they're being deployed on the front in the near future when I'm out there.
So if roboticizing logistics is a way for Ukraine to mitigate one of its weaknesses, that is the vulnerability of its supply lines and the rotation of forces to the front line. I mean, it stands to reason the Russians could do the same, right? So it could be the Russian response to Ukraine's deployment of drones could be to dronify its own logistics.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians are also. It's something that both sides really struggle with, especially with the fiber optics. If you can use the fiber optic drones, target logistics, which the Russians did this very well in Kursk against Ukraine. You target the logistics, you hit them from the flanks, and they're repeating this on each sector of the front, where you use these assaults, you hit them on the flanks, you narrow the supply routes inside, and then you just use the fiber optic drones to hit all incoming supply vehicles, and then often you'll see Ukrainian soldiers running, like having to evacuate by foot when the supply lines are finished. And so I think for Russia, they're also going to be looking to how can we deploy more of these ground robots for assault operations. And even right now, Ukraine's experimenting a lot with these ground robots with machine guns and different type of equipment, and seeing how they can work. And I think you're going to see more of these ground robots being gradually used for assaults. But again, I think they're also very vulnerable to these ground drones. And as soon as you send to FPV drones, so as soon as you send some of these ground robots into an assault and they're in an open field, it's quite a vulnerable target for FPV drones as well. And so I think for right now, when you have these ground robots driving between like forest lines and delivering logistics, it's a bit easier to do that than using more expensive ground robots to do assaults. But certainly both sides are investing a lot of money and a lot of effort to try to develop this.
So as the Ukrainians continue to de-mechanize the Russian armed forces and force them to fight on foot and motorcycle, and at least force the Russians to adapt to a new kind of doctrine that that doesn't really make a major breakthrough possible, and shifts the theory of victory more to the political realm versus a true battlefield victory. So as the Ukrainians continue this effort with drones, with new doctrine of their own, how can everyday people help?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of ways. I think there's ways to help that connect directly into Ukraine's war effort, and then just Ukraine's structure as a whole, and both just ensuring that Ukraine has an adequate amount of attention in the West. So just starting out from what can be done, yeah, in the West, I think one is like keeping Ukraine in the spotlight, giving it attention, ensuring that policymakers, politicians, diplomats keep Ukraine top of mind, keep them in the discourse. And the political dynamics are very challenging, given that even at the recent NATO summit, Ukraine was somewhat of an afterthought and not a headline story. And I think for whether that was to keep Donald Trump on board, or the Europeans just not wanting to clash heads with the Trump administration, and it's certainly a worrying trend, because if that keeps up, I think we're going to see Ukraine fade more and more, and whether it's conflicts in the Middle East, or other wars that could flare up and further draw attention away from Ukraine. And this is what the Russians are banking on, that the West will continue to grow tired, fatigue will set in, and they're going to be more reluctant to confront the Russians and give Ukraine up. And two, I think continuing a lot of Ukraine's war effort is literally dependent on just volunteers and people in garages and tinkering with drone technologies and attempting to develop new types of drones or countermeasures to Russian drones that are bombing Ukrainian cities every day. And there are a lot of Ukrainian organizations that, well, just Ukrainian drone manufacturers in general urgently need more funding. And I'd say, well, amongst other worrying issues, but Ukraine really needs a lot more funding and needs more contracts for drone production, not only to scale production, but to invest into R&D. And at some point, like, the Ukrainian government will need to step in and play a bigger role. And there are good sides, such as the UK and Ukraine attempting to build drones together, then export them, or after Ukraine's battlefield needs are met, being able to export to Britain. But certainly donating to some of these Ukrainian organizations, like the Wild Hornets, that are developing countermeasures or interceptor drones to take out the Russian Shahed drones that are bombing Ukrainian cities every day. And three is, I would certainly like to see more political pressure on Ukraine's government from the perspective of combating battlefield inefficiencies and continuing to drive reforms in Ukraine itself, whether it's a lot of Russian influences creeping back in and ensuring that corrupt figures are removed, and Ukraine continuing to move away from Soviet methods, both within its army, within its government structures, legal structures, and continuing to advance reforms. And advancing these reforms and getting Ukraine to more Western NATO standards is going to be very important in the long term, and even right now. And one thing that frustrates me is just some of the old school Soviet type of generals within Ukraine's military that have kind of regressed to the mean in terms of the comfort zone and relying on old Soviet doctrines that just don't work. And a lot of soldiers are frustrated with, and I think never losing sight of the fact that we should continue to put pressure on Ukraine. I think it's been, especially after the Trump administration took office, so many of the discussions have withered away, and we should absolutely continue to press Ukraine to drive these reforms, because it will make Ukraine more effective on the battlefield. To summarize, I think one, continuing to keep Ukraine in the headlines and talking about it, keeping it atop people's minds. Two, donate to relevant organizations that are doing really important work and helping Ukraine defend itself. And three is just ensuring that there's our policymakers and leaders are well aware of other parts of the front line, such as the battle against Russian influence and corruption that need to be addressed, and helping put that pressure so that Ukraine becomes more effective in how it fights and resists Russia's aggression.
And David, how can our listeners support you?
Um, uh, Perhaps just if in whatever ways that people are supporting Ukraine, whether it's donations or raising awareness and just keeping Ukraine in the spotlight, just continuing to do what you're doing. And for myself, I'm just very focused on the mission. So I guess, whatever reports or articles that I'm producing out there, just continue to share and keep Ukraine in the wider discourse, and remain focused on the cause. And I think all of us have a role to play, and each one of us has a contribution to make. And when you stack everyone's contributions together, that's what makes a bigger impact. And so, yeah, as for myself, it's just whatever I can do to help the mission.
Where should people follow you?
I'm mostly on Twitter and Blue Sky are my primary methods of communication on social media.
Where do you plan to publish following this most recent or this upcoming trip?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on some of the content that I'm able to produce, but certainly there are some outlets well, from a style and editor relationship perspective where I work really well. But I think the Center for European Policy Analysis is one that I write frequently and work very closely with them on, and have a good relationship with the editors. Potentially for different think tanks, whether it's the Lowry Institute in Australia, um, continuing to write potentially for the Atlantic Council, outlets like the Kiev Post, and some more tailored publications depending on if I'm able to get the right type of content. I think a lot of outlets have very specific angles or types of information that they want their readers to have. So I write for as many outlets that I can, that I think will drive an impact, and whatever editors are willing to accept.
David Kirichenko, thank you very much for your time, and best of luck. Be safe.
Thank you.